The air in the small workshop was thick with the smell of hot solder and old coffee. It was a smell that had become a part of him, a second skin. Kalen ran a hand through his already messy hair, his eyes fixed on the glowing green line that danced across the face of an oscilloscope. To anyone else, it was just a squiggle, a meaningless wave of light. To him, it was a whisper of a new reality. Around him, the space was an organized chaos. Wires snaked across the floor like metallic vines. Shelves overflowed not with neat boxes, but with weird materials. Slabs of rough cork, sheets of dense recycled denim, and blocks of a strange, foamy polymer he'd cooked up himself. This was his world, a kingdom built from discarded ideas and stubborn belief. For years, Kalen had been chasing a ghost. Not a spooky, chain-rattling ghost, but an acoustic one. The entire audio industry, he believed, was built on a flawed premise. They sold bigger speakers, more speakers, smarter speakers. They created systems with 7 speakers and a subwoofer, promising surround sound. But to Kalen, it was a lie. It was just sound coming from more places. It was like trying to create a painting by splattering more paint on the canvas from different angles. He didn't want to splash sound at people. He wanted to sculpt it in the air. He called his idea volumetric audio. The dream was to create a device that could make a sound appear to be not just in the room, but at a specific point in the room. A bird's chirp could seem to land on your shoulder. A whisper could feel like it was coming from right beside your ear, even though no one was there. The sound wouldn't come from a speaker. The air itself would become the instrument. He wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to be taking on a multi-billion-dollar industry. He'd started a formal engineering program at a prestigious university full of fire and curiosity, but that fire had almost been extinguished. He remembered sitting in lecture halls, listening to professors talk about the limits of physics, the accepted principles of sound. They spoke with such finality, such certainty, that Kalen felt suffocated. He'd raise his hand and ask questions that started with, "But what if?" and was usually met with a patient, condescending smile. They taught him how to build a better engine, but he wanted to invent flight. So he left. He walked away from the degree, the scholarships, the clear path to a comfortable career, and retreated to this workshop, choosing to be a heretic in his own church of wires and waveforms. His first attempts were clumsy, ugly things. They looked more like a science fair project gone wrong than a piece of revolutionary technology. But they worked. Sort of. He'd managed to create a small, focused point of sound about the size of a grapefruit. It wasn't clear, and it hummed with an annoying electrical buzz, but it was there. It was proof. Armed with this crude prototype and a thick stack of papers filled with complex equations and radical theories, he stepped out of his workshop and into the world of established audio engineering. He thought they would be excited. He thought they would see the future. He was wrong. The first major conference was a disaster. He was given a small slot in a side room, while the main halls were filled with booming presentations from the giants of the industry. These were the big 3, the companies whose logos were on every soundbar and home theater system in the country. They were the kings. Kalen was a jester. He stood at a small podium, his heart thumping against his ribs, and explained his concept. He showed his graphs, his formulas, his shaky video of the grapefruit-sized sound bubble. In the front row, a man with a perfectly tailored suit and a silver mane of hair, the legendary head of research for one of the biggest companies, leaned over to his colleague and chuckled. Just loud enough for the front few rows to hear. The chuckle spread like a virus. Soon, polite, dismissive laughter rippled through the small audience. They weren't laughing with him. They were laughing at him. When the Q&A started, the questions weren't curious. They were designed to humiliate. "Young man," one prominent academic began, a smirk playing on his lips, "have you considered the basic laws of thermodynamics? Or are those just suggestions in your workshop?" The room erupted in laughter again. Kalen felt his face burn. He tried to answer, to defend his work, but his voice felt small and thin, drowned out by the weight of their collective disbelief. That was just the beginning. The public ridicule was one thing, but the quiet behind-the-scenes sabotage was far more damaging. He filed for patents on his transducer designs and his signal processing methods, only to find them buried under a mountain of bureaucratic objections and challenges. Many of them filed anonymously by shell companies he later traced back to the Big Three. He tried to get funding. He met with venture capitalists, men in sleek offices who would listen politely, nod along, and then deliver the same rehearsed line. It's interesting, but our advisors in the industry have some reservations. The science just isn't there. They say he knew who their advisors were. They were the same men who had laughed at him in that conference room. Even his old world turned against him. His former university advisor, a man he once admired, published a widely circulated paper that meticulously tore apart Kellen's theories. The paper used flawed models and selective data to prove that volumetric audio was an acoustic fantasy. It was a professional assassination. The article was shared in every engineering forum, held up as the definitive word on why Kellen was a fool. He became a pariah, a cautionary tale told to ambitious young students about the dangers of straying too far from the beaten path. The giants of the industry didn't need to engage with his ideas directly. They could simply let the world dismiss him for them. They built a wall of silence around him, brick by brick, with every laugh, every rejected patent, and every closed door. And Kellen was on the outside, alone. With only the hum of his oscilloscope and the faint whispering promise of a sound that no one else believed in, the laughter from the conference room echoed in Kellen's mind long after he'd returned to his workshop. It wasn't a loud, booming laugh anymore, but a quiet, constant hum of doubt that seemed to vibrate in the very air he breathed. The public dismissal was just the first volley. The real war was fought in silence, with paperwork and polite smiles that were sharper than any insult. The wall the industry was building around him wasn't made of brick, but of something far more impenetrable: indifference and influence. His first real taste of this came when he tried to secure funding. He had a meeting with a venture capital firm known for backing risky, world-changing ideas. Their office was on the 30th floor of a glass tower, a world away from the solder-fumed reality of his workshop. He sat in a chair that probably cost more than his entire workbench, across from a man in a suit so crisp it looked like it had never been worn. Kellen gave his pitch, his voice more confident this time, refined by the sting of his last public failure. He laid out the vision, the potential, the market disruption. The man listened, nodding slowly, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Kellen finished, the VC didn't laugh. He smiled a sad, almost pitying smile. "It's a compelling story, son," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Truly, but we've spoken to our consultants, people at the very top of the audio world, and they have reservations. They say the physics doesn't hold up. They say it's a gimmick." He leaned forward. "We invest in futures we can predict. And your future, according to the people who built this industry, is a dead end." The meeting was over in 10 minutes. Kellen walked out of the glass tower and into the bustling street, feeling invisible. The rejection wasn't about his idea. It was a verdict delivered by the kings he was trying to dethrone. This became a pattern. Every door he knocked on was closed by the same invisible hand. The industry wasn't just ignoring him, they were actively poisoning the well. His patent applications, which he thought were his shield, became his biggest liability. The legal letters started arriving, first a trickle, then a flood. They were filled with dense, confusing language, but the message was always the same. His patents were being challenged. Objections were filed. Prior art was claimed, often from flimsy, unrelated sources, and demands for more data, more tests, more proof were endless. Each letter required a response from a lawyer, and lawyers cost money he didn't have. He was in a bureaucratic fistfight with a ghost, and every punch he threw cost him $1,000. The financial drain was a slow, creeping panic. At first, he barely noticed. He'd always lived frugally, but soon, the small savings he had set aside began to vanish, swallowed by legal fees and the basic cost of living. He stopped buying new components, learning to repair and reuse old ones. He switched from his favorite brand of coffee to the cheap, bitter stuff from the discount store. The stack of bills on his desk grew taller, their red final notice stamps screaming for attention he couldn't give. The pressure wasn't just on him. It was seeping into his home. His wife, Alara, had always been his biggest supporter. She didn't understand the complex equations, but she understood his passion. In the beginning, she would bring him food in the workshop and listen to his excited explanations, her eyes shining with belief. But that shine was starting to dim. The late-night conversations were no longer about dreams and possibilities. They were about money. One evening, she found him staring at his laptop, at the online banking page. The number was dangerously low. She didn't yell. She just sat down beside him, her voice soft and heavy with a weariness that hurt him more than any anger. "Kalen," she said, her hand resting on his arm. "We can't keep doing this." The mortgage payment was late. The bank called. She looked around the workshop, at the piles of wires and half-finished prototypes. Is it worth this? Is it worth losing everything? He wanted to scream, yes. Of course, it's worth it. But looking at her face, at the fear in her eyes, the words caught in his throat. He saw the worry lines that weren't there a year ago. He saw the sacrifices she was making, working extra shifts at her job to keep them afloat while he chased a ghost. He felt a profound sense of guilt. He wasn't just a heretic challenging an industry. He was a husband, failing his wife. "I'm close, Alara. I swear I am," he finally managed to say. The words sounding hollow even to his own ears. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday. He received an email from his lawyer. Another major patent challenge. It's one from a shell company that a little digging revealed was funded by a partnership of the Big Three. The legal fees to fight it would be more than he had left. Combined with that, a final, scathing review of his theories was published in a major science journal. It's written by his old university professor, the man who is now a highly paid consultant for his rivals. The article called his work a well-intentioned but fundamentally flawed fantasy. It was the final nail in the coffin of his academic credibility. That night, Kalen sat in the dark of his workshop. The soldering iron was cold. The oscilloscope screen was black. For the first time, he didn't see a kingdom of possibility. He saw a junkyard of failure. The weight of it all crashed down on him, the ridicule, the rejections, the legal battles, the fear in his wife's eyes. He felt like a fool. A stubborn, arrogant fool who had thrown away his career, his stability, and was on the verge of throwing away his marriage for a dream that the entire world had told him was impossible. He pulled up a web browser and, with a shaking hand, typed engineering jobs into the search bar. The sight of those familiar, safe, corporate logos felt like a surrender. He was about to click on a listing when his eyes fell on the corner of the room. There, leaning against the wall, were his guitars. A beautiful vintage acoustic, its wood worn smooth from years of playing. A classic electric guitar, its finish gleaming under the single bare bulb he'd switched on. They were his other passion, his connection to the very thing he was trying to perfect, sound. He had bought them long before this obsession took hold, playing in small bars and coffee shops. Feeling the joy of creating something real and immediate, he walked over and picked up the acoustic, his fingers automatically finding the familiar shape of the neck. He didn't play a song. He just strummed a single, clean chord. The note hung in the air, pure and resonant. And in that sound, he didn't hear failure. He heard the reason he started. He remembered the feeling of wanting to share that note. Not just have people hear it from a box in the corner, but to feel it surround them, to feel it as a real, tangible presence in the room. The despair didn't vanish, but something else rose up to meet it, a stubborn, defiant spark. They could take his money. They could ruin his reputation. They could make him an outcast. But they couldn't take this idea from him. It was his. Putting the guitar down gently, a new plan, a desperate, last-ditch plan, began to form in his mind. He wouldn't fight them on their battlefield of lawyers and lobbyists. He would build it. He would build one perfect, undeniable machine. And to do that, he would need cash. A lot of it. He looked at the guitars, not with sadness, but with a new, hard resolve. They were no longer just instruments. They were his ticket back into the fight. The next morning, he called a music store. It was time to sell his dreams to pay for his dream. He was all in. The call to the music store was one of the hardest things Kalen had ever had to do. He had owned the acoustic guitar since he was 17, a gift from his father. Its wood was stained with the sweat from his hands during nervous first performances and marked with the tiny dents of a life lived on the road and in small, smoky bars. The electric guitar was a more recent purchase, a symbol of a small success at a previous job, a reward to himself. They weren't just objects. They were keepers of memories. But desperation is a powerful motivator. When the store owner, a gruff but fair man named Gus, laid out the cash on the counter, Kalen felt a strange mix of shame and resolve. The money felt dirty, like it was born from a betrayal. But as he folded the bills and shoved them into his pocket, he also felt a surge of power. This was his war chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a bullet. With the money from the guitars and the last of their drained savings, Kalen made a difficult choice. He could no longer afford the rent on the small house that held his workshop. The workshop itself was a symbol of a past life, a life of comfort he could no longer sustain. He and Alara had a long, painful conversation. In the end, she moved into a small one-bedroom apartment rented by a friend, while he found a new place to work and live. It wasn't a workshop. It was a self-storage unit. It was a concrete box, 10 by 15 feet, with a rolling metal door that clanged shut like a prison gate. The air smelled of dust and drywall. There were no windows. The only electricity came from a single, exposed bulb dangling from the ceiling and an extension cord snaking from an outlet in the hallway. He moved his essential equipment in himself, the heavy oscilloscopes and power supplies scraping against the concrete floor. The silence of the place, when he stopped working, was absolute and crushing. This was his new reality. This was rock bottom. In this concrete cave, surrounded by the skeletons of his ambition, Kalen felt a flicker of the old fear. He was alone again, but this time it was worse. Before, he had a home to go back to, even if it was filled with tension. Now he had nothing but this cold box. He knew he couldn't do it alone. His skills were in hardware, in the physical manipulation of sound waves, in the art of soldering and circuit design. But the brain of his machine, complex digital signal processing that would control the sound field with pinpoint precision, was a mountain he couldn't climb alone. He was a master sculptor, but he needed a master programmer to breathe life into his creation. One night, fueled by the cheap, bitter coffee he now lived on, he did something he hadn't done in years. He logged into an old, obscure online forum for acoustic heretics and fringe theorists. It was a digital graveyard, filled with old, abandoned ideas and arguments from people like him. He typed out a post, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a message in a bottle, a cry for help into the digital void. He didn't ask for money. He laid out his problem in simple terms. I have the hardware. I can create the sound field, but the control software is beyond me. I need a coder who isn't afraid of impossible math and who hates the status quo as much as I do. I can't pay you much. Just a share of a dream that might go nowhere. He hit post and immediately felt foolish. It was like shouting into a hurricane. 2 days later, as he was staring at a complex circuit diagram, his phone buzzed. An email notification. The subject line was just his forum username. The email was short and to the point. Saw your post? Your math is insane, but it might just be crazy enough to work. The big guys are lazy. I got pushed out of a software giant for suggesting their approach to spatial audio was archaic. I'm interested. Where are you? The name at the bottom was Lena. They met in a Greasy Spoon diner, the only neutral ground Kalen could think of. Lena was not what he expected. She was sharp, with intelligent eyes that seemed to be analyzing everything at once. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, and she looked as tired and world-weary as he felt. He brought a small, portable version of his prototype. He didn't give a speech. He just placed it on the table between them and turned it on. He played a simple recording of a single bee buzzing. He watched her face as the sound didn't come from the device. It seemed to hover in the air a few inches above their salt shaker, a tiny, audible point of life. Her skeptical expression melted away, replaced by a look of intense concentration. She leaned in, her head moving, trying to pinpoint the source. "How?" she whispered, her eyes wide. It was the first time in a year that someone hadn't asked him if it worked, but how. Lena didn't just join the project. She became its other half. She moved a second-hand desk and a high-powered laptop into the storage unit, turning it into a cramped two-person command center. Their dynamic was electric. Kalen would build a new transducer design, a physical piece of hardware that he could feel was right, based on his intuition. Then Lena would take his data and spend days, sometimes nights, writing the code that could control it. They argued constantly. It wasn't angry arguing, but the passionate clash of two brilliant minds from different worlds. He would talk about wavefront shaping and acoustic impedance, and she would counter with algorithmic efficiency and latency buffers. They spoke different languages, but they were striving for the same goal. The days blurred into a cycle of work, sleep, and cheap food. They survived on pizzas delivered to the storage facility's front office and endless pots of coffee brewed on a hot plate. There were moments of crushing despair. A critical circuit board would fry, wiping out days of work. A line of code would have a bug so subtle it would take Lena 48 hours straight to find. Her eyes red and her fingers a blur on the keyboard. Kalen would hit a wall with a physical design, the sound field distorting in ways he couldn't explain. In those moments, the silence of the storage unit would feel like it was closing in on them, and the ghost of their detractors' laughter would seem to echo off the concrete walls. But then, there were the breakthroughs. The night Lena finally wrote a piece of code that could perfectly model Kellen's transducer array in real time. They both stared at her screen, watching a 3D visualization of sound waves coalescing into a perfect, stable sphere in the digital space. They didn't say anything. They just shared a look of exhausted, triumphant understanding. Another time Kalen, using a new composite material he'd devised, managed to create a sound field that was so stable and clear that when he played the sound of a tiny bell, it seemed to hang in the air in the middle of the room, shimmering with a purity that brought tears to Lena's eyes. They were no longer just two people in a storage unit. They were a team, a small, stubborn rebellion against an empire. As the final prototype started to take shape, a single, sleek black tower that looked deceptively simple, they started talking about what came next. They couldn't approach the industry again. They had to force the world to come to them. That's when they came up with the crazy idea. The Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. It was the biggest stage in the tech world, a place dominated by the very companies that had tried to bury them. They had no booth, no sponsorship, no official presence, but they had a room. Using the last of Kellen's guitar money, they booked a cheap suite in a hotel a block away from the main convention center. It was a gamble. A desperate, foolish, all-or-nothing gamble. But as they packed their one perfect machine into a custom-built case, they didn't feel like fools. They felt like they were carrying a bomb, and they were about to walk it right into the enemy's camp. The hotel suite felt 1,000,000 miles away from the glittering chaos of the Consumer Electronics Show. Through the window, they could see the massive convention center, a beacon of light and noise that represented everything they were fighting against. In here, there was only the quiet hum of their machine and the frantic thumping of their own hearts. The room was small and smelled of lemon-scented cleaner. Kalen and Lena had pushed the king-sized bed against one wall to create a small, open space. In the center of it, on a simple black stand, sat their creation. It was a sleek, matte black cylinder, about 3 feet tall, completely unadorned. There were no visible speakers, no grills, no logos. It looked like a minimalist piece of art or a simple trash can. It was the result of 2 years of their lives, every penny they had, and countless sleepless nights in a concrete box. The first hour of their scheduled demonstration time was agony. The door remained closed. The only people who came in were a lost couple looking for the pool and a hotel employee asking if they needed more towels. Kalen paced, his hands clammy. Lena sat rigidly in a chair, staring at the door as if she could will it open. "This was a mistake," Kalen muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We're a joke." "Nobody's coming." Lena didn't answer, but he could see the doubt in the tense set of her shoulders. They had bet everything on this moment, and it felt like the world wasn't even showing up to watch them lose. Then, around the 2-hour mark, the door creaked open. A young man with a backpack and a press badge dangling from his neck peeked in. He looked like a student who had wandered into the wrong lecture hall. Is this the Vance audio demo?" he asked, looking at a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. He was a writer for a small online tech blog, one of the hundreds that covered the show. He'd only come because his editor had told him to find something weird. "Come on in," Kalen said, his voice a little too eager. A few minutes later, another small group wandered in. Drawn by curiosity or the simple fact that this room was the only one on the floor not blasting thumping music. They were a motley crew, and retired engineer who still loved the gadgets. A couple of tourists from Japan who didn't speak any English. And the young blogger? Just as Kalen was about to begin, the door opened again. This time, the people who entered changed the entire atmosphere of the room. There were 3 of them, dressed in expensive suits that looked out of place in the humble suite. They had the confident, slightly bored air of men who owned the world. Kalen recognized them from industry websites. They weren't the CEOs, but they were high-level VPs from the big 3 audio companies. They had heard about the freak show demonstration and had come to enjoy the flop. One of them, a man with a perfectly manicured beard, smirked as he looked at the simple black cylinder. "So this is the little magic trick that's got everyone whispering," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. They leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, ready to be entertained by the inevitable failure. Kalen took a deep breath. He ignored the suits. He looked at the small, curious group gathered on the folding chairs he'd set up. He didn't have a PowerPoint presentation. He didn't have charts or graphs. He just had the machine. "Please, just have a seat," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Close your eyes if you're comfortable. Just listen." He walked over to his laptop, which was connected to the cylinder by a single cable. He clicked on a file. The room went silent. For a long moment, there was nothing. The VPs in the back exchanged a knowing, amused glance. The blogger started to type a note on his phone, probably something about underwhelming. Then it happened. A single sound. Plink. It wasn't loud. It was clear and delicate. And it didn't come from the black cylinder. It sounded like it came from just above the left shoulder of the retired engineer. He flinched, his eyes snapping open. He looked at his shoulder, then at the machine, a look of complete confusion on his face. Kalen let the moment hang in the air, then he clicked again. Plink, plink, plink. Now it sounded like a gentle rain was starting. But it wasn't just a recording of rain. Each drop had a specific physical location. One drop seemed to hit the carpet in the middle of the room. Another landed softly on the window pane. A third plinked against the metal leg of a chair. The sound wasn't in the room. It was of the room. It was as if someone had opened a window to a rainy day, and the real world was leaking in. The Japanese couple, whose eyes were closed, were smiling, their heads moving slightly as if they were following the sound. The blogger had stopped typing. His phone was in his lap, his mouth slightly agape. Then Kalen swiped his finger across the trackpad. A new sound emerged. A soft, gentle whoosh. It was the sound of wind. But it wasn't a generic sound effect. It started on the left side of the room and swirled slowly, gracefully, around the entire group of people. It was a tangible presence. You could feel the air moving, or at least your brain was convinced you could. The wind seemed to brush past your cheek, rustle your hair, and continue its journey behind you. The blogger instinctively ducked his head as the wind passed over him. The retired engineer reached out a hand as if trying to catch it. The VPs in the back were no longer smirking. They had pushed themselves off the wall, standing up straight. Their arms were uncrossed. They were staring at the black cylinder, then at the faces of the audience, then back at the cylinder. The condescension had vanished, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. Kalen let the wind die down. He looked at the faces in the room, lost in the illusion he had created. He took one final deep breath and made one last click. The sound that filled the room next was not a trick. It was not an illusion. It was a low, deep, resonant rumble. It was the sound of distant thunder. But it wasn't just the sound you heard with your ears. It was a feeling you felt in your chest. It had weight and dimension. It didn't come from a corner. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a vast, powerful presence filling the space. It was the sound of the sky itself, and it was inside the room with them. When the thunder faded into silence, no one moved. No one spoke. The room was filled with a profound, heavy quiet, the kind that comes after a truly powerful experience. The young blogger slowly lowered his hands from his ears, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The Japanese couple were bowing their heads slightly, a gesture of deep respect, but the most telling reaction was from the men in the back. The three VPs from the giant corporations looked like they had seen a ghost. Their faces were pale. Their professional composure had shattered, replaced by a raw, naked fear. They weren't looking at the machine anymore. They were looking at each other, their eyes wide with panic. They weren't just seeing a cool new gadget. They were seeing the end of their companies. They were seeing their multi-billion-dollar industry. Built on selling more and more speakers, being rendered obsolete in a 10-minute demonstration, they had come to laugh at a failure, and instead they had witnessed their own extinction. One of them fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. They didn't say a word. They just turned and walked out of the room, their backs stiff, their silence more deafening than any thunder. The heretic had not just spoken. He had blown their world away. The silence in the hotel suite lasted for a full minute after the thunder faded. It was a heavy, sacred silence, the kind that follows a moment of pure, undeniable magic. The young blogger was the first to break it. He slowly lowered his hands from his ears, his phone forgotten in his lap. He looked from the simple black cylinder to Kalon, his eyes wide with a kind of religious awe. "What? What was that?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Kalon felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizzying. But beneath it was a current of pure, unadulterated joy. He looked at Lena, who was leaning against the wall, a rare, brilliant smile on her face. They had done it. In this tiny, forgotten room, they had changed the world. That, Kalon said, his voice hoarse with emotion, is what sound is supposed to sound like. The blogger didn't stay for long. He was a man on a mission. He fired off a dozen questions, his fingers flying across his phone's notepad. Then he was gone, rushing out the door to tell the world. The other small audience members trickled out, too, their faces filled with a wonder they couldn't quite put into words. Soon, only Kalon and Lena were left, alone with their machine and the ghost of the sound it had created. They didn't celebrate. They just stood there, the quiet hum of the device, a comforting lullaby after years of shouting into the wind. Lena walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "They felt it, Kalon," she said softly. "They didn't just hear it. They felt it." He nodded, unable to speak, the weight of the last 2 years suddenly lifting from his shoulders. The blogger, whose name was Finn, found a 24-hour diner and, fueled by coffee and pure adrenaline, wrote the story of his life. He didn't focus on the technical specs. He wrote about the feeling. He described the raindrop on his shoulder, the wind in his hair, the thunder in his chest. His title was simple and direct: The Man Who Blew Up Audio. He posted it at 3 in the morning. By the time the sun rose over Las Vegas, the internet had found it. It started in the tech forums and on social media. At first, it was just a few people sharing the article saying, "You have to read this." But then something special happened. The comments weren't just cool tech, they were personal. People described their own frustrations with sound systems. They shared the article with a simple, powerful message: "This is what I've been waiting for." The article went from a viral hit to a digital wildfire. By 9 a.m., it was the top story on every major tech news site. The name, Kalon, and the strange, impossible demonstration in a hotel suite were all anyone was talking about at the Consumer Electronics Show. When Kalon and Lena arrived at their suite that morning, carrying cups of stale hotel coffee, they were met with a scene they could never have imagined. A line of people stretched down the hallway, around the corner, and out of sight. It wasn't just a few curious onlookers. It was a sea of faces. There were journalists with cameras. Venture capitalists Kalen recognized from the painful meetings of the past, and executives from companies he had only dreamed of working with. He saw representatives from a major car manufacturer, a leading gaming console company, and a giant in the virtual reality space. They all wanted to see the magic. The day was a blur. They did demonstration after demonstration, each one as mind-blowing as the last. The reactions were always the same: disbelief, followed by wonder, and finally, a dawning understanding of the implications. The offers started pouring in. Not just offers of funding, but offers to buy the technology outright. The numbers were astronomical, figures with so many zeros they seemed unreal. Men in suits who had ignored him a year ago were now practically begging for a piece of his company. Then, in the early afternoon, the line parted. 3 men, older and more imposing than the others, walked towards the suite. They were the CEOs of the big 3 audio companies, the very men who had led the charge to discredit him, who had funded the legal battles to ruin him, who had laughed at him from the front row. They didn't look arrogant now. They looked like men who had seen their own graves. They entered the suite, the air growing thick with tension. They didn't smile. They didn't make small talk. The leader, a man named Sterling, whose face was a permanent fixture in the industry's trade magazines, looked at Kalen, his eyes cold and hard. "Name your price," he said, his voice flat. "We'll buy it all. The patents, the company, everything. You and your partner can retire tomorrow." Kalen looked at him, then at Lena. He saw the same thought in her eyes. This was it. The moment they had dreamed of. The escape from the storage unit, the end of the struggle. All they had to do was say yes. But then he remembered the laughter in the conference room. He remembered the condescending smiles of the venture capitalists. He remembered the look of fear on his wife's face. Selling to them would be a surrender. It would be letting them win, allowing them to take his revolutionary idea and bury it in a vault to protect their old, outdated business models. He had not come this far to hand his victory to the people who had tried to destroy him. Kalen took a step forward, addressing not just the 3 CEOs, but the crowd of people gathered at the door. "Thank you for the offer," he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing the confidence he now felt. "But we're not for sale." A murmur went through the crowd. This technology was never about getting rich. It was about making something real. Something better. He looked at Lena. "So we're not selling. We're building. As of today, we are forming our own company. My partner, Lena, is the Chief Technology Officer, and I will be the CEO. We will be licensing this technology, but we will do it on our terms. The terms of innovation, not profit. The terms of openness, not control." The CEO's faces hardened, but there was nothing they could do. The power had shifted. They were no longer the gatekeepers. They were just 3 men in a long line of people who wanted to get in on the future. The final scene takes place a year later. Kalen is standing in a bright new lab, a world away from the storage unit. It's filled with light and the quiet energy of creation. He's not looking at circuit boards or oscilloscopes. He's watching a group of children from a local school who are visiting for a demonstration. A little girl with bright pink glasses is sitting cross-legged on the floor, her eyes closed. A huge smile on her face as the sound of a hummingbird seems to hover right in front of her nose. She giggles and reaches out a tiny hand, trying to touch the sound. A boy next to her laughs as a recording of a bee buzzes in a perfect circle around his head. Kalen watches them, his heart full. He sees the CEOs of the big 3 on television, announcing their own volumetric audio systems that are clumsy, rushed imitations of his work. They are now the followers, scrambling to catch up to the revolution he started. He had faced their walls of silence, their legal attacks, and their ridicule. And in the end, he hadn't just beaten them. He had created something so new and so wonderful that it made their entire empire seem like a relic from a forgotten time. He had created a new sound, and the world was finally beginning to listen.